We are live.
Oh, wow. Okay. Hey, everyone. Welcome to another community forum. Here we get together, we riff about topics that are on our minds or that some of the fellows have been thinking about. We also answer questions that have come to us through our Discord channel. There's actually someone named Hussam who's currently writing a question in the channel. So, Hussam, if you're here, if you can hear us, go, 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 go. We are excited to see this particular question. I think we were just discussing before we went live that there were two questions that we thought we'd address. One is about the work of Michael Levin, and another one is from one of our donors, Joel Diaz. So, Carlos, if you don't mind emceeing this.
Sure.
Um,
So I thought it would be interesting to at least partially address what the conversation got to the point where it's not so much maybe Joel's comment, but where the conversation got. Because what did I reply to here? Yeah. So this is in the context of chronogenesis that we never really addressed fully, and I guess I can reformulate the question or the topic as in an ontology where computation is somehow fundamental, and what exists is defined by what can be generated computationally. It's a little bit unclear where things are coming from, and whether there is some sense of conservation of something, in any way, whether if you think of your states as containing different amounts of stuff, call it information, call it energy, call it mass, matter, whatever. Is there? I mean, certainly, if you just think of arbitrary rewrite rules, that's not going to be preserved. Um, in other perspective, you could think that just the rewrite rules themselves contain all the information, and everything else is some kind of version of what could be, and what could be is always stays constant, and it's only what you observe of what could be that changes. And so I think that's where these comments were sort of pointing towards, and the topic that we could riff about until someone posts the question, or we move on to something like morpho computation. I think the comment just appeared. Um, okay, so abstract algebra. We can certainly talk about that. Galois groups. So I guess Bukash will have something to say.
mhm.
Okay, so this question can be easily addressed. So I don't know. Maybe we can talk a little
You
bit
want
about, or just
you
move
want
to
to
this one.
interrupt the other thing
No,
to
I would, I
address?
would, I would, I would leave this for a bit later because this is easy to answer, and we can.
Okay, okay, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So how about we? Yeah, I mean, if we find this is a very sterile topic and thinking about the ontology of a computational foundation, then we can just move on. But I think some of us have good ideas, and we've discussed it several times. But maybe with the perspective of having had some time to mature, or to ponder on these ideas a bit further, could be interesting to try and refresh. So I guess I open the floor for people to comment.
Sorry, Carlos. What's the exact topic?
Yeah, the topic is the sort of the ontological basis of a computational foundation. So for reality, right? For a model for reality, in a way, which is
Hmm.
not that different from what theoretical physics usually poses, which is some kind of weird quantum continuum or whatever, and things like that. So I don't know. I have my thoughts about that. I don't. I mean, I can say things about that, but if we find it's a very sterile topic and we don't want to spend too much time.
You've raised it. You have some thoughts on
Sure.
it. Maybe you should open the discussion.
Yeah. Okay. So for me, this question is a little bit misguided in the sense that, so asking, oh, how could computation be a foundation? How is it that the entire universe is being generated? Whatever. I think this is a little bit misguided. I think, and I think Nick and I have mentioned it several times in the past, where sometimes you confuse models with experiment or with measurement, and it's kind of whenever whenever you're doing science and you start posing questions about ontology, I have the feeling that you are overstepping a little bit. That I mean, those questions are relevant for scope, and it's important to consider them, and it's not like they're like forbidden thoughts or something like that, but they are certainly a little bit beyond the realm of application of the kind of rational techniques that we normally use to do science, because I mean, ultimately you don't really know. You don't really. It's not. I mean, it's kind of a non. It's an ill-posed question to say, what if computation runs, the entire universe or something like that. It's an ill-posed question in the sense that we perceive computations because we know what it is. We do it, and we same recognize the same in some kind of way, and so if you do computational stuff, then you're gonna see computational stuff. But I don't have I mean, it's kind of all these questions about the ontology of rewrite rules and whether you're generating new states and things like that. I mean, and this can be extremely powerful pictures. So, for example, I like to compare to the modern take on quantum mechanics, this finitary quantum mechanics, where it's kind of what they call it surreal quantum mechanics in some sense, because it's not using real numbers in literal ways, right? So you don't assume that reality is generating real numbers when it computes eigenvalues or things like that. When you collapse a wave function, like there's no actual real number computation going on or complex number computation going on, and it's more about how the randomness of quantum mechanics and the uncertainty is kind of generating this finite amount of information, but in a continuous way. So in a very much non-computational approach to description of reality, which is this view on quantum mechanics, some people call it intuitionistic because it's kind of based on intuitionistic mathematics a little bit more. It's a very similar sort of end claim, which is that things are being generated as we go, right? And I only think it's a good picture. It gives you a good picture, but ultimately it's not going to decide whether a model is more or less effective, or it's not going to decide whether we perform our experiments differently. I mean, it's going to inform questions, it's going to inspire directions of research and all those kinds of things that are very positive, but at the end of the day, those ontological questions are a little bit out of the realm of what can be done. So that's kind of
I completely agree with everything that Carlos said. Sometimes this is referred to as the map territory question, or the question of the relationship between your model and the thing you're modeling. And actually, I think the Argentine novelist Borges wrote an amusing thing on this in an essay called "The Exactitude of Science," on this kind of way in which models and territories can become confused for one another. Often I've raised this question, the ontological question, not because I think that one can necessarily actually account for it within one's computational model. I raise the question because often I fear interest in these computational approaches are motivated by a tacit ontological thirst, some sort of thirst for some sort of explanation of the world where you believe that things truly are computational. So if you come up with something like, Reuel space, you think that it's real, or you think that, processes really are computations and there's some sort of digital underpinning to the way that the world works. So I've often felt kind of compelled to speak negatively to the ontological question, precisely because I do sometimes fear that there's this kind of tacit belief that's held in the real existence of these things, as opposed to just the possibility that rewriting can be a useful model for a kind of constructivist treatment of say mathematical physics, as opposed to just relying on equations in their own right. Because ultimately, you do have to make certain suppositions or ontological commitments when you do this kind of work. Like ultimately, even if you start out with no data structure, you have to presume that there are rules that exist that allow some data structure to appear from an empty data structure. You have to believe that these things exist. You have to suppose that they're running on something or something is causing them to run. And the theory in its own right can't explain physically why rules are possible. They can't explain if rules are possible, why they actually begin, why things run. And so, yeah, I'm not advocating that computational physics try to account for these ontological questions. My recommendation is just a kind of a modesty or a hesitancy, which is exactly what Carlos said, which is the map won't account for the territory. You won't be able to answer these questions within the computational framework. But this also, I think, demands quite a bit of modesty in terms of how what you're saying about the universe. Are you really saying that it's computational? Are you really saying that these rules exist, et cetera, et cetera? I think that I imagine that Bostrom's work on the simulation argument and this kind of thinking probably has. I mean, I see this all the time where people say like, oh, this computational approaches to physics are fresh and interesting because they're explaining like how the simulation works. It's like people use that kind of rhetoric all the time. I think that I've tried to make the point that we should be viewing this more in terms of a constructivist approach to physics, as one would take a constructivist approach to mathematics, and nothing that gets more ontological because we don't have any ontological reach beyond our models. These ontological claims are basically just, I don't want to say they're religious, but you can't account for them, and they just provide a kind of an ontological gratification that I think exceeds your model. And then if it's not religion, it's something kind of akin to religion.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I would say it's a description of spiritual feeling in a way. I mean, and I don't use spiritual in a derogative way. I just mean my definition of spirituality is this feeling of like being aware and conscious and like the weirdness of existing and being, having a sense of self and blah blah blah. So when you need to tackle those nagging questions, your sort of uncertainty of your own existence and so on, I mean, these things might be helpful. I mean, like religions have been helpful historically, or are helpful to people that do crazy stuff around the world.
Yeah, I mean, religious beliefs can be helpful. In certain societies, they've had very helpful social outcomes.
Yeah.
Like they've been used to prevent tyranny and this kind of thing. So yeah,
sure.
Certainly.
But and scientifically, they can be very inspiring as well, for sure.
Sorry?
Scientifically, you can motivate. I mean, some people make this claim. I don't know. I wouldn't attribute that much weight to that, but some people make the claim that Western science has been so obsessed with especially physics, with kind of unifying theories and so on because of monotheistic religions. I think that's a bit of a stretch of correlation, but I mean, there is some claim to that. I mean, if you one comment I would make on that is that you definitely see in the monotheistic traditions, from Judaism to Christianity to Islam, you definitely see a growth in abstraction of the deity that you're considering, in some sense, or at least a change in abstraction. And I mean, Muslims, I think, have a quite abstract notion of God. When you talk to them, it's people that take it seriously but are nonetheless quite rational and open, and have this quite modern outlook in general. The concept of God is very abstract. It's really quite, if you kind of change the language and replace God by whatever, beauty or some sense of or consciousness or existence or something like that, many conversations just work, and you think that that's the topic of conversation, and they're thinking about some entity in an abstract sense, but it's very different, I think, from. And this is when they're speaking of God itself, right? Like this abstract figure. When they speak of other things, it's much more like every other religion, kind of more mundane and whatnot. But when they speak of the sort of theology, it's really very abstract. It's like deliberately abstract, almost like the formulations and so on. So I don't know.
Sure.
It's interesting.
Well, I mean, in Christianity, people actually create pictorial representations of God, which is very different. Usually, he's like some dude with a beard. Kind of looks
Exactly.
like Marx, honestly. Marx with like a robe.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. So I
Maybe
mean,
that'll
Jesus
offend some
called him
people.
called
I
him
don't know.
Father, and so like it's a fatherly figure. It's like Father in eternal Father, whatever. Like it's like many like in Hindu religions, for example, the traditions, like you have very human, like anthropomorphic looking things that, sure, like the legends and the myths are very non-human, but Islam is nothing like that. It's much more abstract, and you know it's maybe that there is some correlation. I mean, I wouldn't say modern science, but maybe there is some correlation between the Islamic Renaissance in the 12th century and that fact that it was a fairly abstract religion in itself. It was very promoting a lot of abstract inquiry just by its nature, just by like scholars were naturally inclined to explore abstraction because it was kind of the name of the game of their culture.
I don't have anything concrete. I was actually looking into this last night just a little bit, but for some other reason. But I don't really have anything that concrete to say about it. One thing though that maybe can kind of segue into the study of Galois groups though is one thing that's been bothering me for quite some time is that
Okay,
the
so moving on
Langlands
to the next
program.
question.
Well, no, no, no. It's relevant to this thing that we were discussing.
Sure.
But it could also, if we want to pivot, you could use it as a pivot to the Galois thing. One thing that bothers me is in public popular press, this increasing description of the Langlands program as this grand unified theory in mathematics, because I mean, not only is it not a grand unified theory of mathematics, it doesn't even it can't even account for all arithmetic phenomenon in like Diophantine geometry, and even there are other approaches to class field theory, which is like one of the key objectives of Langlands that we know kind of do things that the Langlands program can't itself do. So this is another example where in the popular press, for whatever reason, there's this great urge to describe Langlands as this grand unified theory, whereas what's become more popular in, say, Japan is this interuniversal approach where you're passing different arithmetic data between these different mathematical universes, and it's always somewhat incomplete, and you have to try to recover as much data and as much about the properties of these objects as you can. And so you're constantly in this process of kind of passing and performing reconstruction. And reconstruction in Japanese has a specific name, which I'll butcher, but it's like I think it's called something like fukugen. And reconstruction, at least as I understand it, especially in post-war Japanese culture, is like a very important thing. And this has been pretty poorly understood amongst mathematicians outside of Japan, largely because it's been a largely Japanese affair. People haven't traveled that much to discuss it. But it's kind of interesting just right now in arithmetic geometry, number theory, that you kind of have these claims about Langlands being unified, which we know aren't true. And then you have this approach, which is like pretty far from unification. It's about passing communication that's incomplete, about reconstruction and recovery, which is as far from unification as possible. And I do wonder if the fact that this has become well understood in Japan, but it's hard for people outside of Japan to understand, the fact that Langlands is becoming unified. I mean, I don't want to be like an ethno-mathematician and assign cultural explanations to these things, but it is interesting to see that Langlands is increasingly kind of called unified in kind of the Western press. And in Japan, there's this very different approach to number theory that still hasn't gained much traction in the Western countries. So anyway, that's a kind of another interesting counterexample.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we could say a little bit about, I mean, Carlos, I imagine you had quite a bit to say about
Yep.
algebra and rewriting. You even had quite a bit to say about that yesterday, and I'm sure Mukesh has quite a bit to say about
Yeah, I mean,
the
this
role of
question is
Galois in Langlands.
exactly. This
Yeah.
question is addressing, I guess, Mukesh and I more or less equally. So maybe Łukasz, you can have a go, because it technically Gala groups are mentioned before how to use computation to explore algebra. So you can have a go.
Yeah, so what is the end goal here with Galois groups? Well, I think the end goal of like number theory in Galois groups is to understand the absolute Galois group of rational numbers. So basically the structure of algebraic numbers. Yeah, and I don't know, like the Langlands program uses bridges between different parts of math and sort like it's all a very beautiful, very large and complicated and very beautiful piece of formal art that I think I enjoy it when I study it, but just putting it all into your head, like it takes time and effort. And yeah.
We could say a few things. I mean, so one kind of key objective in number theory is to calculate solutions modulo p for some prime p, and this relates to this thing called class field theory. And class field theory has had some limitations, like namely these abelian limitations, these commutative limitations, and Langlands promises to extend towards this non-abelian class field theory. So Galois groups, and this more specific thing within a Galois group called a Frobenius element or Frobenius endomorphism. Galois groups are used in Langlands program. You can say in some sense, one of their roles is to help us calculate in a kind of a field theoretic way or a Galois theoretic way solutions modulo p. Now, one of the interesting things in the Langlands program is this thing called Eichler-Shimura correspondence. And what you find there is there's actually a direct correspondence between calculation of, it's not exactly solutions modulo p, it's actually p minus the number of solutions modulo p, but there's a direct correspondence between that and the prime coefficients in these things called Q series. And once you consider those, then you get into this world of modular forms. So if you have something like a Hecke eigenform, like Eisenstein series, or a cusp form, you can apply these specific operators called Hecke operators to these things. And Hecke eigenforms are eigenvectors under these Hecke operators, which means that they remain invariant with some scalar and they just give off some sort of a spectrum. But it happens that when you apply these Hecke operators, you actually get eigenvalues which are the coefficients in these series. So under Eichler-Shimura, there's this relationship between studying solutions modulo p and basically some spectral data from these modular forms. And so this was something that was discovered like a long time ago at this point, but it's become kind of further generalized higher and higher and higher to automorphic forms and cusp forms and new forms under Atkin-Liner theory, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why when people talk about some relationship between cuspidal representations and Galois representations, this being kind of a key aspect of reciprocity in the Langlands program, basically it ultimately pertains to this key number theoretic question of understanding how many solutions, say, a polynomial admits, where you're asking that question for each p, and you're just taking it modulo p, and you can do that under with Cherepatarov density theorem. You know that you can use Galois theory and Frobenius element to do it, but for some miraculous reason, which I myself still don't really understand yet, using Hecke theory and calculating eigenvalues, you can get similar results. That might have sounded like garbage, but that's my best explanation of how you go from Galois theory to modular forms in Langlands.
Yeah,
Łukasz is laughing.
From somewhere outside the number theory, I think you could basically change any name into like unicorns or something like that. Make about much sense. Yeah, like
Now, one thing about what I was mentioning earlier, there is this nice paper written by Kim called Galois theory and Diophantine geometry, which does get into some of the limitations of the Langlands program and even the kind of ultimate goal of the Langlands program, which are these motivic L functions. It does get into the kind of the limits of these. So I would say that kind of the Galois group and the motive are two kind of important aspects of the Langlands program, but in order to have kind of general treatment of Diophantine geometry, that won't be sufficient. And it's kind of funny because the motive, I think Grothendieck first wrote about the motive in a letter to Serre in like 1965. So it's like, you know, Langlands is in part chasing this dream of Grothendieck's that like comes from the 60s. But then like the critics of approaches to Langlands are interested in like Annavelian geometry, which is something that Grothendieck first introduced, I think, like in the 80s. So in some sense, I think part of the limitations of Langlands are just that they're like they're chasing something that was like during kind of golden age Grothendieck, but they've kind of maybe not yet internalized some of the wisdom of late Grothendieck, semi mad Grothendieck, namely Sketch of a Program, Grothendieck. So anyway, if you're interested in understanding more of the role of Galois theory in Langlands, but also the limitations, there's a paper, Galois theory and Diophantine geometry by Kim. That's quite helpful. Okay, but enough about Langlands. Carlos probably has some concrete things to say to Wissam about rewriting and well, the whole kind of Zapata world of higher arity mathematics in general.
So there's I guess the question is indirectly referring to us to the project that we're doing, because Hussam says intuition as to how this computational paradigm could help explore various algebras. I think that's a reference to what came before it, the Galois groups and Langlands program and so on. But I can certainly say something to that. And there was a question that I'll try to tie it with a question in the chat from our very constant viewer, Memes of Distraction, about anyone else find it humorous that our reality is modeled quite well with the imaginary unit? So I will begin by that. So this idea that the imaginary unit is somehow not very real, or like isn't it funny that imaginary is real and things like that? It's, to be honest, it's purely a consequence of the lexicon used. It's like because you call it imaginary, and suddenly it starts to sound funny. Because complex numbers, all that complex numbers are, it's just rotation, right? It's just 2D rotation. It's just an algebraic encoding of rotation and some other aspects, of course. I mean, there's not just rotation, but it is effectively rotation. So, you know, the imaginary unit is the algebraic expression of, you know, rotate something 90 degrees and do this basic geometric operations. So when you look at it from a geometric point of view, there's really no mystery that the complex numbers are extremely natural to describe reality. When you go through the narrative, the more number theoretic narrative of field extensions and things like that, then it does seem a bit more surprising. And I'm not trying to discount the surprise that mathematical constants show up in unexpected places, because it is a surprise. I mean, pi shows up everywhere and all these kinds of things. I mean, these are non-trivial facts. I'm not trying to dismiss that kind of thing, but particularly the imaginary unit, which is just a unit. I mean, it's not a mathematical constant that is super transcendental and difficult to understand. I find it a little bit, you know, it has a lot of history and a lot of baggage, but you know, it's not really that deep to find that the imaginary unit is so useful. Now, that being said, algebra, so I represents, from the algebraic point of view, represents solutions to equations that make no sense in some context, right? So those are
negative area, for example.
Sorry, say it again.
To me, it represents something like the concept of a negative area, and in quaternions, it's sort of extended to the higher dimension, the IJK representing some sort of negative area cube or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, exactly. So, in a way, when you take, it's like, if you really want to take negative numbers seriously, you actually can have the same, you can have the same critique about negative numbers, because you say, well, I mean, I can only count positive amount. Like, how can I ever count a negative amount? That doesn't make any sense, right? You can't go negative if you keep on going, right? It's not like you loop the circle and suddenly you're in the negatives by counting more, right? So you can, I mean, the abstraction of I is very similar to the abstraction of -1. And so, again, if you take the algebraic approach, it's not so deep in that way, but you do encounter the first instance of an algebra that has some properties that are extremely formally natural and very desirable, and it was by no means obvious to begin with, right? Like, nobody started by doing complex analysis in Mesopotamia or something, right? Like, I mean, they started doing arithmetic, they started doing some rational calculus and things like that, but they didn't immediately jump to say, oh yeah, let's consider this extension and just formal solutions and run with it. That took centuries to develop. So there is this notion that complex numbers have an algebraic prevalence, some kind of importance within all the possibilities of algebras that you can define. And this is where I can take the second half of the answer that was posted more for the Galois groups and the Langlands program thing, but is that with the ability to see, so until now we've only seen these systems as choices of axioms. I mean, you say, well, you want these properties, then you have them, and that's the game of algebra. If we try to approach it computationally, we sort of remove the weight from the choices of axioms and put the weight on the choices of maybe notation or computational support, which I guess is the more general thing to consider. And those are the factors that will determine what your algebras look like and what things you have access to, and so on. And of course, our particular program with the sort of foundations via hypergraph rewriting and trying to define emulations between formal systems and all these kinds of things that we've been trying to do. That's just one manifestation of this phenomenon, where if you choose your computational support wisely, you're getting a lot of things for free. And we're getting these some correspondences between, for example, higher order hypergraphs and higher algebras simply by drawing the right connections. I mean, we're not doing a lot of work, we're just finding the right connections and things work out. So in that sense, computation, I mean, I could speak to the advantages of more traditional computation to mathematics, but I feel like recent history has vindicated that so much that it doesn't need any further encouragement, right? I mean, you look at how computation has completed mathematical programs and how it has led to these automated theorem provers and all this trend in the formalization. And I'm of course of the opinion that these libraries of computational mathematical knowledge, in some sense, that are actionable, that they are actually computing things, you can prove things inside them instead of just listing all the possible proofs. Those are the future of mathematical libraries. I mean, in the past we had books, now we have that. Like, I truly think those are the future of what mathematics looks like, right? So, but here we're trying to do something that goes a bit beyond that. We're trying to provide computational support for humans in particular. I mean, also other entities, other, maybe AIs or some other, or interfaces between libraries, mathematical libraries and things like that. But we are trying to develop the language itself. We're trying to develop the framework itself where these things happen. And so it's not so much that we use computation for that, but we use the computational framework that is going to allow to do that. And that's going to enable many discoveries and advances and things that are already kind of panning out. And it's nice to see.
Wow. Well, that was a really excellent response. That might have been the best response to a question that we've had this entire during these community fora.
I mean,
Yeah.
they just aimed at the right in the right direction to get the good answer. Okay, so
Ooh. Well,
gonna have a brief community forum today. So let's see if there's someone else that have comments and questions on the chat, or some other comments that you fellows have.
well,
of course.
one other thing to do though is neither Richard nor Nick have taken a stab at any of these questions. Maybe they've been patiently or quietly waiting.
No, I was going away for sure.
Do either of you guys have anything you want to add?
No, well, not quite. I can't find anything to hook me to.
Yeah, I know that feeling.
Right now, and yeah.
Yeah, that's how I felt yesterday. Yeah. Mr. Asa?
I was more sort of active listening, but again, the sort of complex number quaternion thing just makes me think of, you sort of go against your intuitions and start thinking about things that sort of don't makes much sense in the geometric sense in the real world, something like a negative area. How could you possibly have a square or cube that has an area that's negative? It's not, it doesn't make sense when you multiply all your dimensions, that you're left with something that can cancel something out. But it becomes a very useful sort of tool, and then there's this whole world of the algebraic, whatever Clifford algebras, blah blah blah, all this stuff that
reflection.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's very powerful. I think when you think of negative numbers, the concept of a negative number is this class of answers to a question that initially might not make sense. So you sort of turn the lack of making sense into an operational object. I find it very beautiful. Like this origin of algebra is like turning questions that are potentially ill-defined to say, no, actually, I don't know, because sometimes they won't be ill-defined. So just consider all the classes of answers to this. And just forget about the nature of the answer. Just define the class of the answers. And
it's nice how mathematics can just sort of reach out and grab something like that, just by defining it as some solution to something or etc.
Yeah, but I think what makes it is not because philosophy would do that. Just fetching something, say, the concept of absence of something like that is kind of paradoxical or something, and philosophy can talk about it, and people can load up in their minds concepts that are kind of impossible and things like that. But I think what is particularly different and makes algebra distinct from philosophy, in my opinion, better than philosophy, or maybe it's a bit too controversial, is that what it creates is an operational, actionable thing. Like you suddenly have operations to do with that. You can manipulate them. You can compute with them, right? Like they behave in the same way that the real things that you're attaching behave. I mean, you take beads, you count them, you put them, separately, two bunches, you put them together, you count them, and the results match. Like that is an operation, right? In reality, and you never thought that by generating these classes of potentially meaningless questions about adding numbers, you're gonna get the same behavior of operations for those abstract negative numbers, right? So it's tempting to always go and say, imaginary unit or quaternions encoding 3D rotation and so on, but it's as elementary as negative numbers that children learn when they are 5, 6 or whatever, and it's already there. Like we make this jump of saying, take this idea of a difference, for example, and the difference can be arbitrary, and you operate with the difference, and it's very beautiful, it's very powerful, and it speaks to this idea of computation and substrate of operation as the goal, right? Because you want your substrate, be it symbolic, be it actual counting beats with an abacus or whatever, you want that to be or a supercomputer, big language model or whatever, but eventually you want something that has a substrate that can operationally implement something that's not just an idea that kind of sounds cool and it's like trippy or something.
Yeah.
Right?
It gives you this rich universe of things to explore, some of which might be unpredictable. Like nobody, when complex numbers were conceived, nobody could imagine the Mandelbrot fractal, for example, as a sort of object that could exist. Meanwhile, philosophers are sitting around wasting their time talking about nothingness
Well,
or something.
I
I'm joking.
I think
That's not a serious comment.
but
Philosophy
one
has.
one thing though is, so I mean personally I think philosophy can be quite rich just in that
Mhm.
it leads people to question, or as one of my teachers once said, philosophy is about trying to think slowly, more slowly than you usually
Mhm.
think about things, which especially I think in contemporary affairs is much needed. But I think if I could try and put my finger on it, I think what mathematics has done precisely by having a formal operational way of doing work is that I think it has led to a culture of respect and collaboration that I think is somewhat quite unique. I mean, I certainly know in the philosopher community, especially if you get towards like kind of more social theory, if there's a dispute, it's basically one person's ad hominem versus another person's ad hominem, and one person's kind of entourage versus another person's kind of entourage, and it can be quite factional and divisive.
Yeah.
There's something about mathematics, which is it's this kind of formal way of doing philosophy or art, such that because it's technical and it's challenging, and it's demanding, if you can do it capably, then there's on the one hand, everyone's participating in the same kind of formal activity. So you don't have this kind of emergence of distinct kind of personalities as you would in I mean, there are people who make distinct objects and distinct contributions, but there's something about it where I think it makes it easier for people to collaborate. It makes it easier for credit and respect to be given to individuals. If you create something and it works, then that's it. And there's no problem with IP or anything like you would see in engineering, and you're doing things precisely. So I think that there's less of this kind of issue that you see in physics where people are, the LQG people are against the string theorists and so on and so forth. I mean, I think there are some fissures in the mathematical community, but there's something about just that formal operationalization that I think makes for one of the better intellectual and scientific communities that exists. And I think that's important.
So logic as a departure from philosophy maybe is kind of what I was thinking. And the formalization of logic and everything that sort of exists beyond that.
All right.
Well, this has been a good forum.
Yeah.
Thanks to everyone who contributed questions. Special thanks to Hussam, who I've never seen before.
Yep.
Thanks for asking that question. That certainly we very much appreciate questions that are highly pertinent to the work that we're doing. So if you have more similar questions, we're happy to entertain those. All right. Well, thanks, guys, and well, I'll see you next week. Cheers.
Goodbye.
Bye bye.